I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 102. And today we are back with the second part of our Brené Brown series with her book Atlas of the Heart. And today it's Terri's turn to share something from that book. And I'm assuming and hoping, because that's the chapter I've written notes on, that you are going to go on to chapter 2. So, fingers crossed. What have you got for us today, Terri?
Well, Daisy, I have chapter 2.
Excellent.
But just to let listeners know, that doesn't mean that we will be covering all of the chapters. There are some that we think are more things we want to talk about, and some that, may not hold our interest quite as much or something. So chapter 2 is called Places We Go When We Compare. Comparison, admiration, reverence, envy, jealousy, resentment, Schadenfreude, and Freudenfreude.
Yes, I'd never heard of Freudenfreude before I read this or listened to it.
Yeah. All right. So I think the big thing in this chapter for me was just the whole idea of social comparison, the impact of it, why we do it. And if you think about it, we are really kind of taught to do social comparison. Anyone who goes through a typical school system, there's always a social comparison. How did you score on this test versus other kids your age? How did you score in this class? How do you line up when you do, in the US, we have this thing called the Presidential Physical Fitness Test. I don't know if they still do that. But again, you're always being compared to other kids and you're comparing yourself. So social comparison is really common and often lies outside of our awareness. Oftentimes we don't recognize that that's what we're doing. And many people have heard the old saying that comparison is the thief of joy. And Brené Brown talks about that comparison almost never leads to happy life satisfaction or positive emotions of love and joy. So true, it is the thief of joy. And it instead leads to more often emotions of fear, anger, shame, sadness. And it's this weird mix for most of us that wanting to fit in, wanting to be in with the crowd, in with the norm, and yet wanting to stand out, wanting to be above others, above average, at least for many things. She describes it as fit in but win, and how complicated that is. And she talks about examples of her swimming and comparing herself to other swimmers.
Yeah, be just like everyone else, but better.
Absolutely.
I thought that was it's so obvious, really, but it's not something I'd really thought of. I mean, everyone knows about comparison and the emotions that comes up with that and the negativity of it, but this tension that's always there between two opposing factions of, conformity and competition. They don't go together, but they do when it comes to comparison.
They naturally
really
kind of follow one another. Absolutely. And the other thing she highlighted about it is that it really tends to be a creativity killer because we almost bind ourselves by that fitting in. So you don't want to get too far out there. And being better than, so you don't want to take too many risks. So it really tends to stifle people's creativity, even risk-taking abilities. She then goes through kind of describing the key comparison words that I mentioned in the title. And the first one she talked about is admiration. And this is when we see something, we see someone doing something, and we're filled with a feeling of inspiration. We want to improve ourselves as we see that example, but not necessarily be like that person or be that person. But it inspires us to want to improve. And then reverence is a feeling of deep respect or love and humility of something sacred. It makes us want to move closer to this thing or person. So when we are in a state of reverence, we want to be more like this quality or this person, whereas admiration just makes us want to improve ourselves, not necessarily like that person. She then talks about a topic in here that she thought was a little more complicated, and she experiences more complication with herself. And that is envy and jealousy, and that they're actually different. And again, things that we tend to use maybe interchangeably. She said that envy is when we want something someone else has. We are envious of something they have earned, have accomplished. And then jealousy is when we fear losing a relationship or part of a relationship that we already have. And I remember when you and I first got on here, I said, I don't even know what my notes mean here, but I figured it out. She said, envy involves two people. So I'm envious that you have, let's say, a brand new car, and it is gorgeous, and I'm envious of that. I want that car, but I don't necessarily want you not to have it. I don't mean that, you shouldn't enjoy your car. I just want it too. And then jealousy involves three people. So again, fear of losing a relationship or part of that relationship to someone else. So let's say you and I are getting along great. We're spending lots of time together, and suddenly you start spending more time with another friend. And I'm wanting that time, and I'm feeling threatened that I'm losing out on this relationship. That's jealousy. Mm-hmm. So envy involves two people, and jealousy involves three people.
So I thought that was a really interesting discussion, because I know I've thought about the two terms before, and I can always remember thinking about the way my mother, for example, talked about the neighbour who was very well off. And yes, he worked very hard, but he earned a huge amount of money. And my stepfather arguably worked, well, not arguably, he did work harder, worked longer hours. And, they didn't bring in the same kind of income. And it was, I recognise it now from what she was talking about, it's envy, but she was saying there can be the negative aspect of envy. There can be the envy where you're envious of what somebody else has, but you don't necessarily not want them to have it. Or you can be envious and you don't want them to have it. And I thought that was kind of the difference between envy and jealousy. So I found it really interesting to hear about this third person, or it can be a group, can't it? That there's a whole different dynamic going on. I thought it was really interesting.
I also enjoyed this distinction she made, and I think this holds true for me as well, that the connotations of these words may sit differently with us. So for example, jealous, we use in a very socially acceptable way, like, oh my gosh, I'm so jealous, tell me more about that. But really, in those situations, we're usually talking about envy. Yeah. I'm so envious. I want to go on that vacation. I want to have that new house or whatever. And even in the emoji and, our shorthand way of saying everything, oh, I'm so jelly, it makes it kind of nice to have jealousy. And when you really think about it, these don't feel good to have, and they're not pleasant toward the other person either. If it's jealousy and you feel threatened, you point out an important piece there, that we can be envious to the point where we don't want the other person. Like we're almost resentful of the fact that they have the thing or the ability or the relationship or whatever it is. And so she talked about these as a cognitive evaluation of how we feel. We think jealousy in response to how we feel: anger, fear, or sadness. I'm feeling sad that you're spending so much time with this other person, so that's jealousy. I'm feeling anger that you canceled plans with me to spend time with this other person or to do something else, so that's jealousy. So it's less actually of a feeling, but more of a cognitive evaluation of the feelings that we're having. I thought that was an interesting take on it.
I thought there was an interesting note that I made about jealousy in particular, that she highlights that that people who are satisfied in their relationships, because we are talking about relationships here, but this is clearly an intimate, well, I suppose it doesn't have to be an intimate relationship. Well, yes, an intimate relationship of some kind, are less likely to be jealous with threats, but are more likely to act much more negatively if there is an actual breach. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was quite interesting. You know, people who are satisfied and feel confident in that relationship will not have so many of these jealous feelings, you know, if somebody's chatting their partner up or something like that. But if there's an actual breach, it's probably game over. No, you know.
Which makes sense.
Yes, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Because the breach is even more egregious then if this person was actually happy in the relationship, and the jealousy has less impact because I'm happy here, I'm solid until the breach actually happens. The next term that she talks about is resentment. And she said she learned something interesting.
Simmering resentment. Yes. You can feel it in the word, can't you? That's definitely a negative emotion.
It's almost, you hear the hissing snake-like sound. Yeah. But she learned something interesting about this when she was talking with an author who writes and researches a lot about emotions. And what he pointed out was that resentment is actually in the family of envy, not anger, because she always thought resentment was holding on to anger. And he pointed out that it's not actually anger. It's more of an envy feeling, a feeling of frustration or judgment, better than, or maybe holding on to a hidden envy related to perceived unfairness or injustice. And it's, you know, the idea that someone has something that we want and we actually find that it's unfair that they have this. And she then talked about actually what this often entails is we feel this when we fail to set boundaries or ask for what we need in a situation. So let's say, for example, you and I work for the same company and I go and have my review and I get my review and it's fine, but I don't get a raise. And you go for your review and you get a raise. I may feel resentment when I find out that you got a raise and I didn't. This is so unfair. The injustice is just not right. But in actuality, I maybe didn't advocate for myself. I didn't ask for what I needed, and maybe you did. So the failure to set boundaries and ask for what we need can play a big role. Another layer of resentment is really that our expectations are let down because of things that are outside of our control. And when we feel that we don't control things, we have to kind of place this feeling somewhere. And again, the unfairness, the injustice of it often winds up being experienced as resentment.
I thought the interesting point that I think towards the end of that came out, that the question that you need to ask yourself if you're feeling resentment is, what do I need but am afraid to ask for?
Yeah.
Which is so true, isn't it? I mean, I think I seem to remember she illustrated the point with weekends spent with her husband and feeling resentment. And they were kind of actually both feeling resentment because they didn't get the time to do the things they wanted to do. And there was all this resentment going on. And they resolved that basically by having a discussion and telling each other what they needed and had previously been afraid to ask for. Said, you know, these are the expectations. This is what I would like to get out of the weekend. This is what I would like to carve out time to do, if at all possible. And they both shared that with each other. So they both actually knew what was in each other's head. Because that's quite often the problem, isn't it? That you're feeling resentment against somebody else, but they have no idea what the problem is with you.
Right. So their expectations weren't being met. And in actuality, it was because they hadn't expressed their expectations. They hadn't negotiated those together so that they could plan the weekend. Now I'm remembering more about that example, in that they both found that when they were the only parent at home navigating the weekend with their kids,
they preferred it.
They felt fine. It was when they were both home navigating it, then they were resentful that they didn't get to do more things. But again, it's because they hadn't expressed their expectations and made a clear plan. it's interesting to me how she writes this book too and uses those personal examples. I know I benefit from personal examples, and just listening to someone like Brené Brown has conflict in her relationship because she's not expressing herself enough. It's like, okay, Terri, you're not so far off then. It's okay that you're struggling with this or that you've had problems with this. And then the next two are pretty new terms for me, really. And I probably mispronounce them. You probably have a better take on them, being that you're more connected to other languages maybe than I am. But Schadenfreude and Freudenfreude.
Perfect.
Newer terms for me. And actually, I think she gave a little bit of history, and I didn't write this down, but that it really, these words didn't even become kind of commonplace in the US until an episode of, was it The Simpsons?
Oh, yes. I can't remember what it was. Yes, that's reminded me now. I can't remember what the program was.
I think it was a show like that.
Yeah.
And then a more recent reference on Ted Lasso, which everyone seems to be loving. So Schadenfreude is taking pleasure in someone else's failings. And this is a hard one, I think, for us to admit. Mm-hmm. It's not really a positive thing to be pleased by someone not doing well.
Well, there's kind of a jokey side to it, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of humor. There's a lot of sketch show that's based on that. The light-hearted side of it is laughing when somebody falls over in a comical way. Mm-hmm. When you're supposed to laugh at it. A Mr. Bean type, I guess. Mm-hmm. There is a sort of light side to it as well.
But interestingly, what are the characteristics of people that it's associated with? Envy, narcissism, aggression, and anger. And it's negatively correlated with empathy and conscientiousness. So, if you're feeling this fairly often, that might be something worth looking at. Wow, I'm spending more space or more time in the space of envy, narcissism, aggression, and anger versus empathy and conscientiousness. And she was fascinated by this when she was learning more about it, but that it's born out of inferiority, not superiority. So it's not someone looking down on someone. It's actually someone feeling less than and therefore getting pleasure out of watching someone else fall, watching someone else struggle or suffer. And again, it's kind of based on fear, powerlessness, and a sense of deservedness. So it really made me think, I want to be really mindful of if I'm experiencing Schadenfreude, what's going on with me? Am I feeling powerless? Do I have a sense of deservedness? Like that person's getting something I want. Oh, good, they just lost it. What is going on with me to experience that? And something that, again, going back to the personal examples, I'm not going to quote this how she wrote it, but I thought this was so cool. She talked about how she and her husband really kind of taught this value to their kids, that when people care about you, like your friends, you want them to do well and you don't enjoy when they struggle. And they use this example, if you maybe can even clarify this better than I do, but it's kind of like if you're lighting a candle and it's windy or, there's a breeze, your friends would cup their hands around it because they want to see you succeed. And so they taught their kids as they were growing up, no candle blower outers. We don't blow out other people's candles. We want to see them thrive and do well and succeed. And so I think that was a nice way of discouraging Schadenfreude.
Yeah, I like that too. It was a nice image. I thought there was a little bit before you move on to the final bit that I thought that you would find interesting about. They'd actually studied and were looking at people's brains, but it was the different parts of the brain that light up with Schadenfreude, and the increase in feel good and encourages future behavior along the same tack. So it's not only negative in the moment, but it actually encourages more of that kind of negative way of viewing people, which is not a good thing.
Absolutely. There's carryover in these things. And the opposite of This is Freudenfreude, which is actually enjoyment of others' success. And you can imagine what you just described would happen in the opposite way with Freudenfreude. The opposite of what happens with Schadenfreude is that when I take pleasure in seeing you succeed, I carry more of those positive feelings with me in other situations. So, how we are experiencing and interpreting things affects our future feelings and ways of interpreting things.
There was something, not really a negative from Freudenfreude, but a note I made about it, that there can be negative reactions when you fail to get Freudenfreude from your friends, from your family. So, if you share something that you are expecting this Freudenfreude and you don't get it, and if that keeps happening, that can lead to depression and ends up being a connection killer if people fail to share that joy. And I'd made a note, good friends fan your flame or protect it when it's under threat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I hear this a lot, even in the community in which I work, that if I'm talking about my health plan and what I'm doing, and other people can't get on board with that and feel happy for me as I'm making progress and making changes, it really affects my ability to connect with them. It's almost like they start to become unsafe because they're not fanning that flame. They're maybe potentially being more of a candle blower outer, and that really damages relationships.
Yeah, and she mentioned, I think, towards the beginning, that connection. She quite often talks about the antidote emotional feeling, doesn't she? And she mentioned that connection is actually, can be an antidote to the problems caused with comparison. There was one thing I made a note about that I really liked, that's kind of a general thing, but she mentioned a conversation that she'd had with somebody called Scott Sunshine, fabulous name. And it was about that good old saying, the grass is always greener on the other side. And he said in this discussion with him, he was talking about the science behind the fact that actually it literally does look greener, but it is the same. And so comparison is irrelevant, but perspective is key. It's where you're looking at it from. I thought that was another brilliant thing that came out of this chapter.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I think so much of our being in a place of comparison is from a slanted, almost negative view. How am I not enough? How is someone better than? Or if we are more narcissistic or more kind of a overdeveloped ego, we may look down on and see ourselves as superior or better than. So I thought this chapter was interesting, and I just invite people to think a little bit about how these emotions and assessments of what they're feeling play a role for them, and maybe bring a little more Freudenfreude to their relationships, check themselves if they're experiencing Schadenfreude, and maybe just, think about when you're using that so jelly emoji, what you're really saying.
Yes, absolutely. I know it's something that I continue to work on, but it's certainly something I've done a lot of work on in the past, is this whole jealousy, envy situation, because I know how it can make you feel. It's actually an interesting part of how Daisy was born. But there you go. That's a story for another time. I hope you have a very wonderful week, and I'll see you back here, same time, same place, for another chapter of Brené.
Sounds good, Daisy. Take good care, everybody.
Have a great week.
researchers that talked about it, that it's born out of this is where, when you're typing notes quickly, I have born out of infertility, not superiority.